When Kang Ji-Hoon, a 36-year-old syndicate boss whose network controlled Seoul's underground worth $240 million, descended the crumbling concrete steps into the city's most forsaken homeless shelter on a February night where the temperature inside barely crept above freezing, the last thing he expected was to find his own mother, Lee Sun-hee, 68 years old, huddled beneath a stranger's embrace in a tomb of flickering fluorescent light. The woman protecting her was so worn down by the world's cruelty, she looked like she'd been carved from exhaustion itself. Her tattered red dress, barely clinging to shoulders that had carried too much for too long. Her dark skin ashen from cold and hunger, yet her arms wrapped around Sun-hee with a ferocity that made Ji-Hoon's chest constrict in a way no bullet ever had. The shelter reeked of mildew and desperation, the kind of place Ji-Hoon had only ever sent people to disappear, never to be found. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed and crackled like dying insects, casting shadows that made the concrete walls look like they were breathing. And there she was, the woman who had once commanded his father's entire organization from behind silk curtains and mahogany doors, now trembling in layers of mismatched sweaters that hung off her like borrowed skin, while a black woman the city had ground down to nothing, a woman whose name Ji-Hoon didn't even know yet, pulled off her only coat, heavy and dark and probably older than some of Ji-Hoon's soldiers, and tucked it tighter around Sun-hee's fragile frame. Then she did something that made Ji-Hoon's hand instinctively reach for the gun at his hip. She positioned her own body between his mother and the draft seeping through the cracked foundation, a human barrier against a world that wanted to devour them both. Ji-Hoon felt time fracture the moment his Italian leather shoes touched the filthy concrete floor. His perfectly tailored three-piece suit, darker than the shadows pooling in the corners, suddenly felt obscene against this backdrop of human suffering. His heart, a muscle he'd trained to beat only in service of strategy and survival, slammed against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt since he was 12 years old, and watching his father's enemies burn down their first home. Fear, an emotion he'd excised from his nervous system with surgical precision 15 years ago, wrapped around his throat and squeezed. Behind him, his enforcers fanned out like a forest of steel and tactical gear, their rifles tracking movement in the darkness. But all Ji-Hoon could see was his mother's silver hair catching the sickly light, her eyes distant and clouded, lost somewhere he couldn't follow. He couldn't process why his mother was here, 3 levels below the city that pretended people like her didn't exist, why every security protocol and every informant and every bloodstained dollar he'd spent searching had led him to this moment 5 years too late. He couldn't understand who this broken woman cradling her was, why she looked him dead in the eye without flinching when his men had cleared the room, why she hadn't scrambled away the second she saw the guns. But what he was about to discover on this frozen concrete floor, surrounded by the city's forgotten and discarded, wouldn't just shatter everything he thought he knew about the stranger in the red dress who had nothing yet gave everything. It would force him, a man who had orchestrated the disappearance of politicians over breakfast meetings, a man whose name made prosecutors resign rather than pursue, a man who had built an empire on the principle that loyalty could be bought and compassion was a luxury only the powerless could afford, to confront a truth that would crack the foundation of everything he'd become. To face what actually matters when all the power, all the blood money, all the fear you've cultivated in others, turns to ash in your hands the moment you realize someone loved your mother more than you ever showed her. If this story is gripping you the way it should, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when a killer has to choose between his empire and the one person who proved that love isn't a transaction. Comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and know how far our story is reaching across the world. Because sometimes one story can crack open a heart that's been locked in ice for years, and you're about to witness the moment when absolute power meets absolute grace, and only one can survive.
Ji-Hoon's voice cut through the shelter like a blade through silk when he finally spoke, low and controlled, the kind of tone that had made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit. Who are you? The question wasn't curiosity. It was an interrogation disguised as conversation, each syllable weighted with the promise of consequences. His men had formed a perimeter around the 3 of them, their boots crunching on debris that probably told stories no one wanted to hear. And you're going to tell me exactly how you captured my mother. The woman, this stranger whose arms were still wrapped protectively around Sun-hee, looked up at him with eyes that held something Ji-Hoon hadn't seen directed at him in over a decade. Complete absence of fear. Not the manufactured bravado of rival bosses trying to save face before a bullet, but genuine bone-deep calm. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from cold and probably from screaming into the void this place represented, but it didn't waver. Captured. She repeated the word like it was in a language she didn't speak. Your mama ain't been captured by nobody. She's been kept alive. There's a difference. Ji-Hoon took a step closer, and his second-in-command, Min-jae, moved with him, hand hovering near the weapon at his side. The woman didn't flinch. She just held Sun-hee tighter, and Ji-Hoon watched his mother's face, that face he'd memorized through childhood photographs and desperate memories, turn into the stranger's shoulder like a child seeking comfort. His mother, who had once stood beside his father as they executed traitors in their own dining room, was now clinging to this woman like she was the only solid thing in a world made of water. I asked you a question, Ji-Hoon said, and this time there was an edge to it, the one that usually preceded violence. How did you get her here? Who sent you? What organization are you with? The questions came rapid-fire because in Ji-Hoon's world, there were no coincidences. There were only strategies he understood and strategies he hadn't uncovered yet. The Han Syndicate? The Busan crew? One of the Chinese operations trying to gain leverage. The woman's laugh was bitter and short, more exhalation than humor. I don't know what any of those words mean, and I don't want to. She looked down at Sun-hee, whose silver hair was tucked beneath her chin, and when she looked back up at Ji-Hoon, there was something fierce in her expression that made him reassess his initial judgment of her as broken. She wasn't broken. She was forged. Your mama showed up here 3 winters ago, confused and scared and talking about a son who was coming to find her. She had a jade bracelet on her wrist. I sold it to buy her medicine when she got pneumonia. That's the only thing of value she had, and I spent it keeping her breathing. Ji-Hoon's jaw tightened. That bracelet had been his grandmother's, passed down through 4 generations, worth more than this entire shelter and everyone in it. The fact that this woman had sold it for antibiotics felt like both a violation and a gift he didn't know how to accept. You had no right. I had every right, the woman interrupted, and Ji-Hoon felt Min-jae tense beside him because nobody interrupted Kang Ji-Hoon. Nobody. I had the right of someone who was here when she needed help and you weren't. I had the right of someone who held her hand through fever dreams where she called out for you. So yeah, I sold a bracelet. And I'd do it again. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the shelter's depths and the quiet whimpering of other residents who'd pressed themselves against the far walls, trying to become invisible to the men with guns. Ji-Hoon studied the woman's face, really looked at it for the first time. She couldn't have been more than 30, but the shelter had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her face was smudged with dirt and exhaustion, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested she'd stopped caring about appearance around the same time she'd stopped expecting life to be kind. But her eyes, those eyes that met his without wavering, held something unbreakable. What's your name? Ji-Hoon asked, and this time the question was different. Softer, though he'd never admit it. Maya, she said. Just Maya. And before you ask, I'm nobody. I don't have people looking for me, I don't have debts you can leverage, and I don't have information you can extract. I'm just someone who couldn't walk past an old woman who needed help. Ji-Hoon crouched down then, bringing himself to their level, his expensive suit jacket pulling tight across his shoulders. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw how much the years had stolen. Her face was thinner, her hands trembled slightly, and when her eyes focused on him for just a moment, one brief lucid moment, he saw a flicker of recognition before it drowned in confusion again. Iyama, he said quietly, using the Korean word for mother that felt foreign on his tongue after so long. It's me. It's Ji-Hoon. Sun-hee's response was to press herself further into Maya's embrace, a small sound of distress escaping her throat. Maya's arms tightened automatically, protectively, and she started murmuring something too low for Ji-Hoon to hear, some combination of comfort that made his mother's breathing even out. He watched this stranger soothe his mother in ways he didn't know how to, with a tenderness he'd forgotten existed, and something in his chest, something he'd thought was calcified beyond repair, cracked just slightly. We're leaving, Ji-Hoon announced, standing up abruptly. All of us. Now. Maya's response was immediate and non-negotiable. No. Min-jae actually laughed at that, a sharp bark of disbelief, because people didn't tell Ji-Hoon no. People didn't refuse him. People who tried usually ended up as cautionary tales whispered in the dark corners of Seoul's underworld. But Ji-Hoon held up a hand, stopping whatever Min-jae had been about to do, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. That wasn't a request, Ji-Hoon said. And that wasn't an answer that's gonna change, Maya replied. Look at her. She gestured to Sun-hee with her chin, unable to move her arms from their protective position. You walk her out of here right now, surrounded by men with guns. Taking her somewhere she don't know, she's gonna break. Whatever's holding her mind together, it's gonna snap. Is that what you want? Ji-Hoon looked at his mother again, saw the way her fingers were clutched in Maya's coat, saw the rapid rise and fall of her breathing that suggested panic barely held at bay. He'd studied human psychology as thoroughly as he'd studied tactical warfare. You didn't build an empire without understanding what made people break, and he knew Maya was right. His mother's mind was already fractured. Shock could shatter it completely. Then you come with us, he said to Maya, and it wasn't quite a command but it wasn't quite a request either. You keep her calm. You help her transition. And then, he paused, pulling out his phone and opening a banking app with practiced ease, turning the screen toward Maya where numbers that could change lives sat waiting. Then I transfer this to whatever account you want, and you disappear. Forever. With enough money to never see a place like this again. Maya glanced at the screen, and Ji-Hoon watched her eyes widen slightly as she processed the zeros. It was enough money to buy a house. Multiple houses. Enough to erase her from this life and rewrite her into something better. He'd seen people kill for a tenth of what he was offering. Hell, he'd ordered people killed for less. But Maya just looked back up at him with something that might have been pity in her expression, which was absurd because she was the one sitting on a concrete floor in a homeless shelter while he stood above her in a suit that cost more than she'd probably seen in her lifetime. Keep your money, she said quietly. I don't want it. That was when Ji-Hoon felt the foundation of his understanding shift, just slightly, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Because in his world, everyone wanted money. Everyone had a price. That was the fundamental truth around which he'd built his entire philosophy. Everything could be bought, everyone could be controlled, and love was just economics with emotions attached. But this woman was looking at numbers that represented freedom and security and every material comfort she'd been denied, and she was saying no. Then what do you want? Ji-Hoon asked, and he hated how the question came out, like he was the one without power in this exchange. Maya's answer was simple and devastating. I want you to treat your mama like she's a person, not a possession you lost and found. And I want to make sure she's safe before I go anywhere. That's it. That's my price. Ji-Hoon stared at her for a long moment. This woman who had somehow managed to insult him, reject him, and establish terms with him in the span of a single conversation. Min-jae was making a gesture that suggested they could just take them both by force, but Ji-Hoon shook his head slightly. Force would traumatize his mother further, and something in him. Some part he didn't want to examine too closely. Didn't want to see fear in Maya's eyes, didn't want to be the thing that broke whatever integrity she was holding on to. Fine, he said. You come with us willingly. You help her adjust. And when you're satisfied she's safe, you leave. On your terms. He extended his hand down toward her, an offer to help her up, and Maya looked at it like it might be a trap. I give you my word. The word of Maya paused, choosing her terms carefully. Syndicate boss. That's supposed to mean something to me. It means everything to me, Ji-Hoon replied, and he was surprised to find that was actually true. I don't break my word. Ever. It's one of the few rules I follow. Maya studied his face for another long moment, then slowly, carefully, she began the process of helping Sun-hee to her feet. Ji-Hoon moved to assist, and his mother flinched away from him hard enough that Maya had to steady her. The rejection stung in a way he hadn't expected, in a way that felt disproportionate to the action. Min-jae and two other men moved forward to help, but Maya waved them back with a fierceness that made them actually stop. Give us space, she said. All of you. She needs room to breathe. And incredibly, impossibly, Ji-Hoon found himself stepping back and ordering his men to do the same. They created a perimeter at a distance while Maya slowly, patiently, got Sun-hee standing. The older woman was unsteady on her feet, leaning heavily on Maya, and Ji-Hoon noticed for the first time how thin his mother had become, how the clothes hung off her frame like they were designed for someone else. Guilt, sharp and unexpected, cut through him. 5 years. She'd been here for 5 years while he'd torn the city apart looking for her, and somehow she'd still managed to slip through every search, every informant, every carefully constructed net. The walk from the shelter to Ji-Hoon's car felt like it took hours even though it was probably only minutes. His men had cleared the stairs and the street beyond, creating a corridor of intimidating efficiency. People who'd been lingering in the shadows melted away at the sight of armed guards, and Ji-Hoon was grimly satisfied by their fear even as he noticed Maya's expression tightening with each display of his power. She was starting to understand exactly what kind of world she'd accidentally entered, and he could see the realization settling over her features like frost. The SUV was armored and luxurious, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salary, and Maya stopped short when she saw it. "This is a mistake," she said quietly, but Ji-Hoon heard the waver in her voice. "I don't belong in your world." "She don't either, not anymore." "She never stopped belonging," Ji-Hoon replied, holding the door open. "She just got lost for a while." Maya helped Sun-hee into the back seat, sliding in beside her, and Ji-Hoon took the seat across from them, separated by luxury leather and a gulf of understanding neither of them could cross. Min-jae got behind the wheel, and as they pulled away from the shelter, Ji-Hoon watched Maya's face in the dim interior lighting. She was looking out the window at the city rolling past, and he wondered what she was seeing. Whether it was the same Seoul he knew, the networks of power and money and violence that connected everything like neural pathways in a massive brain, or whether she saw something else entirely. His mother had fallen asleep almost immediately, her head resting on Maya's shoulder, and Maya had automatically adjusted her position to support the weight. Ji-Hoon found himself unable to look away from that simple gesture of care, from the way Maya's hand came up to smooth his mother's hair with a tenderness that felt like a foreign language he'd never learned to speak. In his world, affection was strategic. Loyalty was purchased. Love was a weakness to be exploited in others and excised from oneself. But watching Maya cradle his mother's sleeping form, her own exhaustion evident in every line of her body yet somehow still managing to provide comfort, Ji-Hoon felt the first stirrings of something he didn't have a name for. It wasn't respect, exactly, though that was part of it. It wasn't gratitude, though he felt that too. It was something closer to recognition, like seeing a mirror image of something he might have been in another life, in a world where circumstances hadn't required him to become a monster. The penthouse was 60 floors above the city, a fortress of glass and steel that offered panoramic views of Seoul's glittering skyline. Ji-Hoon had bought it 5 years ago, right after his mother disappeared, telling himself it was an investment property. But he'd never stayed there, never furnished it beyond the basics, because something about the empty rooms felt too much like grief-made architecture. Now, as Min-jae pulled into the private garage and they took an elevator that required 3 different security codes to operate, Ji-Hoon wondered if some part of him had always been preparing this space for her return. Maya's reaction to the penthouse was everything Ji-Hoon expected. Wide eyes, shallow breathing, the physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance as her brain tried to reconcile the shelter she'd left with the luxury she'd entered. The main living area was massive, decorated in minimalist modern style that probably looked cold to someone like her. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spread out below them like a constellation, and Ji-Hoon watched Maya walk to the glass, still supporting his mother, and stare out at a world that must have looked alien from this height. "There's 3 bedrooms, Ji-Hoon said, his voice echoing slightly in the sparsely furnished space. "Your mother can take the master. You can have the guest room. I'll stay in the 3rd. "I don't need," Maya started, but Ji-Hoon cut her off. "You need to sleep. You need to eat. You need to shower." He said it clinically without judgment, but he saw her flinch anyway. "There's clothes in the closet, probably not your size but better than what you're wearing. My assistant keeps this place stocked with basics in case I need to house someone unexpectedly." The irony of that statement, that he'd occasionally used this place as a gilded cage for people who needed to be kept comfortable while also being kept contained, wasn't lost on him. Maya seemed to sense it too, because her expression shuttered, became more guarded. "And if I want to leave?" she asked. "Then you explain to my mother why you're abandoning her," Ji-Hoon replied, and he knew it was a low blow even as he said it. "You think she'll understand? You think her mind can process that kind of loss right now?" Maya's jaw tightened, and Ji-Hoon saw anger flash across her features, bright and cleansing. Good. Anger he could work with. Anger meant she was still fighting, still had that spark that had let her survive in a place designed to extinguish hope. "That's manipulation," she said flatly. "That's truth," Ji-Hoon corrected. "Look at her." They both turned to where Sun-hee was standing near the window, her hand pressed against the glass like she was trying to touch the city lights beyond. Her reflection in the window showed a face creased with confusion, and she was murmuring something too low to hear. Maya moved to her immediately, automatically, and Ji-Hoon watched his mother's entire body relax at Maya's touch, watched her turn into the embrace like a flower turning toward sunlight. "Mama," Maya said softly, using the same term of endearment she'd used in the shelter. "Let's get you settled. You hungry? We can find you something to eat." Sun-hee's response was in Korean, rapid and distressed, and Ji-Hoon translated automatically. "Where are we? Where's the room? Where's the corner?" She was asking about the shelter, about her spot on the floor, about the only home she could remember. Maya looked at Ji-Hoon helplessly, and he saw the exact moment when she understood the trap she was in. She couldn't leave because his mother needed her. She couldn't stay because everything about this place, about Ji-Hoon's world, went against whatever moral code she'd been holding on to. She was caught, and they both knew it. "The bedroom's this way," Ji-Hoon said, leading them down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Maya had seen in her lifetime. The master bedroom was large and comfortable, with a bed that could fit 4 people and a bathroom that had more amenities than some hotels. He watched Maya's face as she took it in, saw the way she was calculating exits, assessing threats, trying to figure out how to keep his mother safe in an environment that felt anything but secure to her. His mother settled onto the bed with Maya's help, and within minutes she was asleep again, her breathing evening out into the slow rhythm of exhaustion finally given permission to rest. Maya stood over her for a long moment, then followed Ji-Hoon back into the main living area, leaving the bedroom door cracked open so she could hear if Sun-hee woke. "There's food in the kitchen," Ji-Hoon said, gesturing toward the open-plan area that held appliances Maya had probably only seen in magazines. "Help yourself to whatever you want. I need to make some calls." But Maya didn't move toward the kitchen. She stood in the middle of the living room, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold despite the penthouse's perfectly regulated temperature, and looked at Ji-Hoon with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you help her adjust," Ji-Hoon said. "You keep her calm. You give her stability until her mind can process the change." "And he paused, pulled out his phone, looked at the notifications stacking up from his organization, all the business that had been paused while he chased this ghost. "I figure out who knew she was there and didn't tell me. Someone had to know. Someone always knows." "And then?" Maya pressed. "You kill them?" Ji-Hoon looked at her evenly. "Probably." He watched Maya process that, saw the way her moral compass was spinning, trying to find north in a world where the rules she'd lived by didn't apply. "Your mama," she said slowly. "She ever tell you stories?" "When she was lucid." "About what?" "About you. About how you used to be." Maya's voice was quiet but firm. "She told me about a boy who cried when he found an injured bird, who brought it home and made a nest for it out of his own blankets. She said you stayed up all night trying to save it." Ji-Hoon felt his expression harden into something carved from ice. "That boy died a long time ago." "Did he?" Maya asked. "Or did you just bury him so deep you forgot where you put him?" The question hung in the air between them, and Ji-Hoon found he didn't have an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. So instead he turned away, pulled out his phone, and started making the calls that would set his world back in motion. Behind him, he heard Maya move into the kitchen, heard the quiet sounds of her opening cabinets and figuring out how to use appliances that probably seemed absurdly complicated. He didn't offer to help. Didn't turn around. Just stood by the windows and looked out at the city he controlled while talking to men who would kill at his word about people who would die at his order. But even as he conducted business, even as he slipped back into the role of Kang Ji-Hoon, the ice boss, the man without mercy, he could hear Maya moving through his space. Could hear her checking on his mother. Could hear the soft sounds of care that felt like an invasion of something he'd thought was sealed off. And when he finally ended his calls hours later and turned around, he found Maya asleep on the couch, still wearing her tattered clothes because she'd been too focused on his mother to take care of herself. Her hand stretched out toward the bedroom as if even in sleep she was reaching to protect someone who needed her. Ji-Hoon grabbed a blanket from the linen closet and spread it over her without waking her up. It was a small gesture, probably meaningless in the grand scheme of everything that had happened, but his hand lingered for just a moment on the blanket's edge. Then he pulled back, retreated to his own room, and tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd done something kind without expecting payment in return. The next morning arrived with Seoul's particular brand of organized chaos. Millions of people moving through their routines while Ji-Hoon's world operated in the shadows beneath. He woke early, showered, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, and emerged from his room to find Maya already awake, sitting at the dining table with Sun-hee, trying to coax her to eat breakfast. His mother was picking at rice with chopsticks, her movements uncertain, and Maya was speaking to her in slow, simple English mixed with what sounded like badly pronounced Korean words she'd probably learned in the shelter. "Eat, Mama," Maya was saying. "You need your strength." "Look, I'm eating too, see?" She took an exaggerated bite of her own food, and Sun-hee mimicked the action like a child learning through repetition. Ji-Hoon watched from the doorway, unnoticed, and felt something shift in his understanding. Maya wasn't just helping his mother out of obligation or fear. She genuinely cared. The evidence was in every patient gesture, every soft word, every moment of attention that went beyond what duty would require. It was the kind of care that couldn't be faked or purchased, the kind that came from some internal source Ji-Hoon had convinced himself didn't exist in people anymore. "Good morning," he said, announcing his presence, and watched both women look up. His mother's face showed brief confusion before settling into vague acceptance. Maya's showed wariness, like she was perpetually braced for the other shoe to drop. "Morning," Maya replied, her tone neutral. "Your mama had a rough night." She woke up a few times confused about where she was. "I stayed with her." Which meant Maya probably hadn't slept more than a few hours total. Yet here she was, functioning, caring, persisting. Ji-Hoon moved into the kitchen area, started making coffee with the expensive machine that probably looked like a spaceship control panel to Maya, and tried to figure out how to navigate this new dynamic. He wasn't used to having people in his space, wasn't used to the domestic quality of breakfast and small talk and the quiet sounds of someone else's presence. His phone buzzed. Min Jae's name on the screen. Ji-Hoon answered, listened to the brief report, and felt his blood turn to ice water. "When?" he asked, his voice dropping into that register that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Last night," Min Jae replied. "We just confirmed it. The Han Syndicate has been tracking our movements. They know about the penthouse. They know you found her." Ji-Hoon's eyes went to his mother, still eating slowly under Maya's patient guidance, and felt strategy and emotion collide in his head. The Han Syndicate had been his family's rival for 3 generations, a blood feud that had been running so long most people had forgotten how it started. If they knew his mother was alive, they'd see her as the ultimate leverage. The way to break the Kang line once and for all. "Double the security," Ji-Hoon ordered. "I want perimeter coverage within the hour. And Min Jae? Find out who leaked the information. I want them alive. For now." He ended the call and found Maya watching him with those 2 perceptive eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," Ji-Hoon lied, but he saw her expression tighten because she knew a lie when she heard one. "Just business. The kind of business that gets people killed?" Maya asked, and there was an edge to her voice now, a brittleness that suggested she was reaching her limit. "The kind that might hurt her?" She nodded towards Sun-hee. Ji-Hoon wanted to lie again, to offer false reassurance, but something about Maya's directness demanded honesty. "Yes," he said simply. "There are people who would use her to get to me. People who've been looking for her as long as I have, but for different reasons." Maya was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting protectively on Sun-hee's shoulder. "Then we leave," she said finally. "We take her somewhere they can't find her. Somewhere that's not part of your world." "There is nowhere," Ji-Hoon replied, and he heard the cold certainty in his own voice. "My world is everywhere. The only way to protect her is to be stronger than the people who want to hurt her. Which means keeping her here, where I have control." "In a cage," Maya said flatly. "In a fortress," Ji-Hoon corrected. But even as he said it, he knew the line between the two was thinner than he wanted to admit. The day progressed with Ji-Hoon making calls and Maya caring for his mother, and slowly, imperceptibly, they developed a rhythm. Ji-Hoon would handle business from the living room while Maya worked with Sun-hee in the bedroom, playing simple games that stimulated her memory, showing her photographs Ji-Hoon had pulled from old archives, trying to build bridges between who she had been and who she was now. Sometimes Ji-Hoon would pause in his calls and just listen to the sounds of Maya's voice drifting from the other room, the gentle patience of it, the way she never got frustrated even when his mother asked the same question 5 times in 10 minutes. And sometimes he'd find himself walking to the bedroom doorway and just watching them, this tableau of care that felt like it existed in a different universe from the one he inhabited. By evening, when Seoul's lights began their nightly transformation of the city into something that looked almost beautiful from 60 floors up, Ji-Hoon found Maya standing at the windows again, staring out at the sprawl below. His mother was asleep, exhausted from the day's mental efforts, and the penthouse had settled into a quiet that felt almost peaceful if you didn't know what kind of violence was always lurking just beneath the surface of peace. She asked about you today, Maya said without turning around. Your mama. She had a clear moment, maybe 5 minutes of real lucidity. Asked if her son was safe. If he was happy. Ji-Hoon moved to stand beside her at the window, maintaining careful distance. What did you tell her? I told her yes to the first question, Maya said. Didn't know how to answer the second. They stood there in silence for a while, two people from worlds so different they might as well have been from separate planets, watching the city breathe below them. Finally, Maya spoke again, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. You asked me what I wanted earlier. Your price for doing this. You said you didn't want money, Ji-Hoon reminded her. I don't, Maya confirmed. But I do want something. I want you to tell me about the boy who saved the bird. The one your mama told me about. I want to understand how that boy became this. She gestured vaguely at Ji-Hoon, at the expensive suit and the cold expression and everything he represented. Ji-Hoon felt his jaw tighten. That's not a story worth telling. Then tell me a different one, Maya pressed. Tell me something true. Because right now, all I see is a man who treats his mama like an asset that got stolen and a woman who helped her like a problem that needs solving. And I need to believe you're more than that if I'm gonna stay here and help her. The request was manipulative in its honesty, and Ji-Hoon recognized the tactic even as he felt himself responding to it. Maya was good at this, at cutting through defenses with simple directness, at making the complicated feel straightforward. It was probably how she'd survived the shelter, by being real in a place where pretense got you killed. My father, Ji-Hoon began, surprising himself, believed the world was divided into predators and prey. He raised me to be a predator. Taught me that mercy was weakness, that empathy was a liability, that the only way to ensure survival was to be the thing everyone else feared. He paused, looking down at the city. The bird was when I was 7. Before the training really took hold. I cried for days when it died despite everything I did to save it. My father told me tears were worthless, that if I'd wanted to save the bird, I should have been strong enough to change its fate through force of will alone. That's a terrible thing to tell a child, Maya said quietly. That's a necessary thing to tell a heir, Ji-Hoon corrected. Because when I was 16, someone tried to kill my father. Shot him right in front of me. And because I had been trained to be a predator, I didn't freeze. I didn't cry. I killed the assassin before he could finish the job. Saved my father's life by being exactly what he'd taught me to be. Maya absorbed that, and Ji-Hoon could see her trying to reconcile the image of a child crying over a bird with the reality of a teenager killing a man. Did it feel good? She asked. Saving him. It felt necessary, Ji-Hoon replied. Like breathing. That's not the same thing, Maya observed. No, Ji-Hoon thought. It's not. But he didn't say it out loud. They stood there a while longer, and slowly, carefully, Maya began to talk about her own past. She spoke about growing up in a neighborhood where opportunity was a myth people told themselves to sleep at night, about a mother who'd worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep them housed, about watching gentrification push them further and further to the margins until there were no margins left, only the edge. She talked about the night her mother died, exhausted and alone in an emergency room that had made her wait 6 hours because she didn't have the right insurance, and how Maya had promised herself she'd never be that powerless again. But then I ended up in the shelter anyway, Maya said with a bitter laugh. Turns out you can promise yourself all kinds of things and still end up exactly where you were trying to avoid. The only difference was, this time I wasn't alone. I had Mama. She smiled slightly, a small expression that transformed her tired face into something gentler. She needed me, and that made all the difference. Gave me a reason to keep going when I'd run out of reasons for myself. Ji-Hoon listened to this confession and understood, perhaps for the first time, why Maya had rejected his money. Because money was what people like him thought mattered. But Maya had learned that survival meant something different. It meant connection, purpose, being needed by someone who couldn't survive without you. His mother had given Maya a reason to persist, and Maya had given his mother protection that went beyond physical safety into something that resembled family. The Han Syndicate, Ji-Hoon said abruptly, changing the subject because the conversation was venturing into territory he didn't know how to navigate. They've been my family's enemy for decades. If they know my mother's alive, they'll come for her. Use her as leverage to control me or simply kill her to hurt me. Either way, She's in danger until I neutralize the threat. How do you neutralize something like that? Maya asked. Usually with violence, Ji-Hoon admitted. But that creates its own problems. Blood feuds have a way of perpetuating themselves. I kill their people, they kill mine. The cycle continues until nobody remembers why we're fighting, only that we are. So break the cycle, Maya said, like it was simple. Ji-Hoon almost laughed at that, at the naive optimism of it. You don't break cycles in my world. You ride them until they break you. That's a choice, Maya countered. You're choosing to believe you don't have other options because that's easier than actually looking for them. The accusation stung because there was truth in it, but Ji-Hoon pushed back anyway. I have to protect her. That's not a choice I'm making, that's a responsibility I have. And in my world, protection means eliminating threats before they eliminate you. And what does your mama think about that? Maya asked. You ever ask her if she wants to be protected at the cost of more death? More violence? Ji-Hoon didn't have an answer for that, because he hadn't asked. Hadn't even considered asking. His mother's dementia made her opinions questionable anyway, but Maya's point cut deeper than the surface question. Even if his mother were lucid, would he have consulted her? Or would he have simply made the decision he thought was right and expected her to accept it? The question hung between them as the night deepened and Seoul transformed into its after-dark self, all neon and shadow and the kind of beauty that disappeared when you looked too close. Eventually Maya excused herself to check on Sun-hee, leaving Ji-Hoon alone with his thoughts and the city that both was and wasn't his kingdom, depending on how you measured power. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he stood at the windows and watched the city breathe, and thought about birds and bullets and the moment when a boy who cried became a man who couldn't. Thought about his mother in the shelter, lost and confused, and a stranger who'd given her everything when she had nothing to give. Thought about the fundamental equation he'd built his life around. That power was the only currency that mattered, and felt the first real doubt about whether that equation was actually true. In the bedroom, through the cracked door, he could hear Maya's voice murmuring something soothing to his mother, who'd woken from a nightmare. Could hear the rustle of movement as Maya repositioned herself to provide comfort. Could hear, in the spaces between words, the sound of love that asked for nothing in return. And Ji-Hoon realized, standing there in the dark with his city spread out below him like a game board, that he was starting to understand the difference between having power over something and actually being able to protect it. The understanding terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The breach came at 3 a.m. on the 4th night, when the city was at its quietest and Ji-Hoon's guards were at their most vulnerable to the particular brand of exhaustion that came from maintaining perfect vigilance for days on end. Ji-Hoon had been working in his office, a converted bedroom that overlooked the eastern skyline, when the security system didn't so much fail as whisper its last breath. The lights didn't flicker. The alarms didn't sound. One moment the penthouse was secure, and the next moment Ji-Hoon felt the presence of someone else in his space the way prey animals sense predators, through some ancient instinct that bypassed conscious thought. He moved silently from his office, his hand finding the weapon he kept holstered at the small of his back, and became the thing his father had trained him to be, a hunter in his own territory. The main living area was dark except for the ambient glow of the city through the windows, casting everything in shades of blue and shadow. Ji-Hoon's eyes adjusted quickly, scanning for movement, for anything out of place in the minimalist space where every object had its designated position. The figure was good, professional grade, the kind of assassin that cost more than most people's homes, but Ji-Hoon had been doing this since he was 16, and he recognized the slight shift in air pressure that meant someone was moving through his space. The assassin was heading toward the bedrooms, toward his mother, and Ji-Hoon felt rage flood through him with the clarity of ice water. Not the hot, impulsive anger of amateurs, but the cold, calculated fury that made him dangerous. He could have called for his guards, could have triggered the silent alarm that would bring Min-jae and the others crashing through the door in seconds. But something in him, some primal part that his father would have recognized and approved of, wanted to handle this himself, wanted to be the last thing this assassin saw before the world went dark. Ji-Hoon moved like water around furniture, closing the distance between himself and the intruder with a kind of fluid efficiency that came from years of practice. The assassin sensed him at the last second, turned with professional speed, but Ji-Hoon was already inside his guard. His weapon pressed against the man's ribs in the spot where a bullet would puncture a lung and make screaming impossible. "Who sent you?" Ji-Hoon asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and the assassin responded by trying to pivot away, reaching for a weapon of his own. Ji-Hoon didn't give him the chance. He pulled the trigger once, the suppressed shot making a sound like a cough in the quiet penthouse, and watched the assassin crumple to the floor with a kind of efficiency that came from hitting exactly the right spot. The man wasn't dead. Ji-Hoon had deliberately avoided anything immediately fatal because corpses didn't provide information, but he was rapidly approaching that state, his breathing shallow and labored. Ji-Hoon crouched beside him, his weapon still trained on center mass, and asked again, "Who sent you?" The assassin's response was a wet laugh that brought blood to his lips. "Han," he managed, the single-word confirmation of everything Ji-Hoon had suspected. "They know. She's here. They're coming. For all of you." Ji-Hoon processed that information in the fraction of a second it took his heart to beat once. If the Han Syndicate had sent one assassin as a probe, there would be others. This wasn't an isolated attempt. It was reconnaissance, a test of his defenses before the real assault. Which meant he had minutes, maybe less, before. "Ji-Hoon." Maya's voice cut through his tactical analysis, and he looked up to see her standing in the hallway outside his mother's room, silhouetted by the dim light bleeding from the bedroom. She was wearing clothes he'd had delivered. Simple, practical things that actually fit her, and her expression was alert despite the hour, like she developed the shelter resident's ability to wake completely at the slightest disturbance. "Get back in the room," Ji-Hoon ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." But Maya's eyes had already found the body on his floor, the spreading pool of blood that looked black in the ambient light, and he watched her face transform from confusion to horror to something harder that he recognized. The survivor's instinct to assess and adapt rather than freeze. "He's not alone, is he?" she asked, and Ji-Hoon was struck by how quickly she'd grasped the situation. "No," Ji-Hoon confirmed, already moving toward his phone to trigger the full security protocol. "Maya, I need you to take my mother and—" He didn't get to finish the sentence because that's when the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and repelling lines, and Ji-Hoon's world became tactical chaos. 3 more figures swung into the penthouse with a kind of synchronized precision that spoke to extensive planning and significant resources. The Han Syndicate wasn't playing games. They'd committed serious assets to this assault. Ji-Hoon's training took over, his body moving before his conscious mind fully processed the threat. He fired twice, catching one of the repelling figures in the shoulder and sending him spinning on his line, but the other 2 hit the floor already moving, their weapons tracking for targets. Maya disappeared back into the bedroom with a speed that suggested her survival instincts were as honed as his own, and Ji-Hoon felt a flash of relief that she hadn't frozen, hadn't become another liability he'd have to protect while fighting. The next 30 seconds were pure violence. Ji-Hoon used the furniture as cover, moving through his own space like he'd choreographed the fight in advance, because in some ways he'd always known his penthouse might become a battleground, had always understood that safety was temporary and preparation was everything. He took down the second assassin with a shot that was more luck than skill, the bullet catching the man in the throat in a spray of arterial blood that painted the minimalist white walls in abstract patterns. The third assassin was better, smarter, using the darkness and the overturned furniture to his advantage. They exchanged fire in a deadly dance that destroyed $10,000 worth of art and shattered the illusion that money could buy immunity from violence. Ji-Hoon felt a bullet graze his shoulder, hot and sharp, but he didn't slow down, didn't give the pain permission to register as anything more than information. He flanked left, forcing the assassin to choose between maintaining cover and losing sight of the bedroom, and when the man hesitated, just a fraction of a second, Ji-Hoon made the choice for him, putting 2 bullets center mass with the kind of precision his father would have been proud of. The silence that followed the gunfire was profound, broken only by Ji-Hoon's controlled breathing and the distant sound of sirens that might have been for him or might have been for any of Seoul's other nighttime emergencies. He did a rapid assessment. 3 confirmed dead, 1 dying, his shoulder wounded but functional, and the bedroom where Maya had taken his mother still secure. "Maya," he called out, moving toward the bedroom with his weapon still raised because the first rule of survival was to never assume the threat was over. "It's clear. You can." The door opened before he finished, and Maya emerged with his mother behind her, both of them unharmed but shaken. Ji-Hoon saw immediately what Maya had done. She'd barricaded the door with furniture, created a makeshift barrier that wouldn't have stopped a determined assault but would have bought her precious seconds to hide Sun-hee in the closet or bathroom. His mother was clutching Maya's hand like a lifeline, her eyes wide and confused but mercifully not fully comprehending what had just happened. "Are you hurt?" Maya asked, her eyes going to the blood on Ji-Hoon's shoulder, and he was surprised by the concern in her voice. "It's nothing," he lied, because his father had taught him that admitting to pain was the same as admitting to weakness. But Maya was already moving toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she wasn't going to accept his dismissal. "Let me see," she insisted, and when Ji-Hoon tried to wave her off, she fixed him with a look that could have melted steel. "You can't protect her if you bleed out from stubbornness." "Let me see." Ji-Hoon found himself complying, lowering his weapon and shrugging out of his jacket so Maya could examine the wound. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she peeled back his shirt, her touch clinical but not cold, and Ji-Hoon found himself watching her face as she worked rather than looking at the damage himself. "It's a graze," Maya announced after a moment. "Needs cleaning and bandaging but nothing that requires a hospital." She looked up at him, and in the dim light her eyes held something that might have been respect. "You got a first aid kit in this place, or does someone like you just walk off bullet wounds?" "Bathroom cabinet," Ji-Hoon said, gesturing toward the master bedroom. "Under the sink." Maya disappeared to get the supplies, leaving Ji-Hoon alone with his mother, who was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment, just one brief crystalline moment, her eyes cleared, and he saw recognition there, real recognition, not the vague awareness she'd shown before but actual understanding of who he was. "Ji-Hoon, she said, using the affectionate form of his name that he hadn't heard in 5 years, and her voice was completely lucid, completely present. "My son." Ji-Hoon felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the violence he'd just committed and everything to do with the ache of recognition. "Iyama," he managed, moving closer to her. "I'm here. You're safe now." His mother reached up with trembling hands and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of adulthood that had replaced the boy she'd known. "You've become so hard," she said softly, and there was sadness in her voice. "So cold. What did they do to you?" "They made me strong enough to protect you," Ji-Hoon replied, but even as he said it, he heard how hollow the words sounded. "Is that what you call this?" His mother gestured vaguely at the carnage in the living room, at the bodies and blood and broken glass. "Strength." She shook her head slowly, and Ji-Hoon saw tears forming in her eyes. "Your father raised you to be a weapon. I tried to stop him, tried to keep some part of you soft, but I failed. And then I failed again by disappearing when you needed me most." "You didn't fail," Ji-Hoon said urgently, because he needed her to understand this. "You survived. That's all that matters." "No," his mother said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "That's not all that matters. How you survive matters. Who you become matters." She glanced toward the bedroom where Maya had gone to get supplies. "That girl, Maya. She has nothing. No money, no power, no protection. But she has something you've forgotten how to have." "What's that?" Ji-Hoon asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "A soul that hasn't been sold," his mother replied. "A heart that still knows how to love without calculating the cost." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "She's the daughter I never had, Ji-Hoon. The daughter I wished I could have given you as a sister. Someone who could have shown you there was another way to be strong." The words hit Ji-Hoon like physical blows, each one landing in the place where he kept the parts of himself he'd thought were dead. Before he could respond, Maya returned with a first aid kit, and his mother's lucidity began to slip away like water through fingers, her expression clouding over again as whatever neurological magic had granted her those few minutes of clarity withdrew. Maya worked on Ji-Hoon's shoulder in silence, cleaning the wound with a kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done this before, though probably not with bullet grazes. Ji-Hoon watched her face as she concentrated, saw the way her tongue pressed against her teeth when she focused, saw the small crease between her eyebrows that deepened when she was worried about hurting him. These tiny details, these moments of humanity, felt more dangerous than the assassins had been because they threatened something he couldn't defend with weapons or strategy. "We need to leave," Ji-Hoon said once Maya had finished bandaging him. "They know where we are now. They'll send more." "Where do we go?" Maya asked, helping him back into his shirt. "You said your world was everywhere." "It is," Ji-Hoon confirmed, already mentally running through options and finding them all inadequate. "But there are some places that are harder to reach than others. I have a property outside the city, more isolated. We can fortify there while I deal with the Han Syndicate permanently." "Deal with them how?" Maya pressed, and Ji-Hoon heard the challenge in her voice. "How do you think?" he replied, his tone flat. "I eliminate the threat at its source. I kill everyone who knows about my mother's survival, everyone who might come after her. I end this." Maya looked at him for a long moment, And Ji-Hoon saw something shift in her expression, some calculation happening behind her eyes. "And then?" she asked quietly. "After you've killed them all? What then?" "Then she's safe," Ji-Hoon said as if it were obvious. "Until the next threat," Maya countered. "Until the next enemy who wants leverage. Until the next time your world decides she's a useful target." She shook her head slowly. "You can't kill your way to safety, Ji-Hoon. Not real safety. Not the kind that lets her actually live instead of just survive." "You don't understand my world," Ji-Hoon said, but there was less certainty in his voice than there should have been. "No," Maya agreed. "But I understand your mama. And I know that what she needs isn't more violence done in her name. What she needs is a son who can figure out how to be something other than what his father made him." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Ji-Hoon felt Min-jae's arrival through the emergency entrance before he heard it. Felt the shift in the penthouse's energy that meant his second-in-command had brought reinforcements. Within moments, his people were flooding into the space, securing the perimeter, documenting the assault, removing the bodies with the kind of clinical efficiency that came from years of practice in cleaning up violence. Min-jae approached Ji-Hoon with the expression of someone delivering news they knew wouldn't be well received. "We've confirmed the leak," he said quietly. "It was Park. He's been feeding information to the Han Syndicate for the past 6 months. We have him contained, waiting for your orders." Ji-Hoon processed this betrayal with the part of his brain that had been trained to treat treachery as inevitable rather than surprising. Park had been with his organization for 8 years. Had been promoted based on what Ji-Hoon had thought was loyalty and competence. The discovery that he'd been compromised felt like confirmation of everything his father had taught him. Trust was a liability, and the only person you could rely on was yourself. "I'll handle it personally," Ji-Hoon said, and saw Min-jae nod in understanding. But then Ji-Hoon felt Maya's eyes on him, felt the weight of her judgment and his mother's earlier words, and found himself adding, "After I get them to safety. The interrogation can wait." Min-jae looked surprised. Ji-Hoon had never prioritized anything over immediate tactical response, but didn't question the order. "I'll have the convoy ready in 10 minutes, he said, already moving to make it happen. The next several hours were a blur of tactical movement as Ji-Hoon's organization shifted into crisis mode. They transported Sun-hee and Maya to the property outside Seoul, a reinforced compound that Ji-Hoon had purchased years ago as insurance against exactly this kind of scenario. The drive took 90 minutes through Seoul's pre-dawn streets, with Ji-Hoon constantly monitoring communications and coordinating his people's response to the Han Syndicate's aggression. Maya sat in the back with his mother, keeping her calm through the confusion of another relocation, and Ji-Hoon found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than tactical awareness required. He watched Maya comfort his mother with soft words and gentle touches, watched her transform fear into something manageable through nothing more than presence and patience, and felt the foundations of his worldview continuing to crack. They reached the compound just as dawn was breaking over the mountains east of the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like the world was burning. The property was isolated and defensible, surrounded by walls and security systems that would make any assault difficult if not impossible. Ji-Hoon's guards took up positions while he helped Maya get his mother inside, into a space that was less luxurious than the penthouse but felt somehow more secure in its solid, fortress-like construction. Once Sun-hee was settled and resting, Ji-Hoon found Maya standing on the compound's eastern wall, looking out at the sunrise with an expression he couldn't read. He joined her there, maintaining the careful distance that had become their unspoken agreement, and for a long moment they just stood in silence and watched the light transform the landscape. "Your mama said something before," Maya finally spoke, not looking at him. "When she was lucid. She said I was the daughter she never had." Maya's voice was soft, almost wondering. "Nobody's ever said anything like that to me before. Nobody's ever looked at me and seen family." Ji-Hoon felt something twist in his chest, some emotion he didn't have a name for. "She meant it," he said quietly. "My mother doesn't say things she doesn't mean, even when her mind is confused." "I know," Maya replied, and now she did look at him, her eyes bright in the dawn light. "That's what makes it hurt so much. Because I've been thinking about what happens after this is over. When your threat is neutralized and your mama is safe and I'm supposed to leave. And I realized I don't want to. I want to stay with her. I want to be the daughter she never had for real, not just while it's convenient." "Then stay," Ji-Hoon heard himself say, and the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Maya. "As what?" she asked. "Your employee?" Someone you pay to take care of her? That's not family. Ji-Hoon. That's just another transaction in a life full of them. She was right, and Ji-Hoon knew it. But he didn't know how to offer what she was asking for, didn't know how to transform their arrangement into something that resembled actual connection rather than contractual obligation. He'd spent his entire adult life reducing relationships to their transactional components, to calculations of value and leverage, and the idea of something that couldn't be quantified or controlled felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. Before he could formulate a response, Min Jae appeared with news that shattered the moment. We have a problem. The Han Syndicate has made their move. They're not coming here. They went back to the shelter. Ji-Hoon felt his blood turn to ice. The shelter? Why would they? They're broadcasting, Min Jae interrupted, pulling up a video on his tablet. Streaming live to every criminal network in Seoul. They're saying they have evidence you've gone soft, that you're protecting someone who isn't worth protecting. They're using the shelter as a stage to destroy your reputation. Ji-Hoon took the tablet and watched the feed with growing horror. The Han Syndicate had occupied the shelter where he'd found his mother, and they were terrorizing the residents, forcing them to testify on camera about how Ji-Hoon's mother had been there, had been one of them, had been reduced to the level of society's most desperate. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal. They were using his mother's past vulnerability to undermine his present strength. But it was worse than that. As Ji-Hoon watched, he realized the Han Syndicate was systematically working through the shelter's residents, and they were going to kill them. All of them. Everyone who had seen his mother, everyone who could testify to her time there, everyone who represented the story they were using to destroy him. They were going to turn the shelter into a mass grave and broadcast it as evidence of what happened when you showed weakness in their world. They're baiting you, Min Jae said quietly. They want you to come. They know you can't let this stand. Can't let them slaughter innocents in your name. It's a trap. I know it's a trap, Ji-Hoon replied, his voice cold and controlled even as his mind raced through tactical scenarios. But what choice do I have? If I don't go, if I let them kill those people, I prove everything they're saying about me. And more importantly, he glanced at Maya, saw her face as she processed what was happening. I become exactly what my father raised me to be. Maya's expression was stricken, her eyes fixed on the tablet screen where people she'd probably known, people who'd survived alongside her in the shelter, were being lined up for execution. You have to stop them, she said, and her voice shook with rage and grief. Those people, they're not part of your world. They don't deserve to die for this. No, Ji-Hoon agreed. They don't. He handed the tablet back to Min Jae and started issuing orders with the rapid-fire precision of someone who'd been planning for war his entire adult life. He called in every resource, mobilized every asset, turned his entire organization into a spear aimed at the Han Syndicate's heart. But even as he coordinated the tactical response, even as he transformed from a man having breakfast with his mother into a warlord preparing for battle, part of his mind was on Maya's words from earlier. You can't kill your way to safety. I'm going with you, Maya announced, and Ji-Hoon turned to stare at her like she'd lost her mind. Absolutely not, he said flatly. You stay here with my mother where it's safe. Those are my people down there, Maya shot back, her voice fierce. I lived with them. Survived with them. Some of them kept me alive when I didn't want to be. I'm not going to hide in your fortress while they die. You'll be a liability, Ji-Hoon said bluntly. You're not trained for combat. You'll get yourself killed and possibly compromise the entire operation trying to save you. Maya stepped closer to him, and Ji-Hoon saw something in her eyes that reminded him of his mother's earlier lucidity. Absolute, unshakable conviction. Then train me on the way, she said. Or don't. But I'm going. You can try to stop me, but I promise you I'll find a way to get there even if I have to steal a car and drive myself. Ji-Hoon stared at her, trying to find the tactical argument that would make her see reason, but all he could think about was how much she reminded him of his mother in that moment, stubborn and fierce and willing to die for what she believed in. And he realized, standing there with dawn breaking around them and a battle approaching that might end them all, that he didn't want to stop her. Didn't want to keep her safe if safety meant making her into something she wasn't, into someone who could walk away from people who needed her. Fine, he said, and saw Min Jae's expression shift to alarm. But you stay behind our lines. You don't engage. You're there as witness and support for the survivors, nothing more. The moment shooting starts, you get down and you stay down. Understood. Maya nodded, and Ji-Hoon saw relief flood her features. Understood. The drive back to Seoul felt longer than it should have. Every minute waited with the knowledge of what was happening at the shelter while they raced to intervene. Ji-Hoon had positioned his forces strategically, coordinating a multi-point assault that would hit the Han Syndicate from 3 directions simultaneously. But he knew the opening moves would be critical. If they telegraphed their approach, the Han Syndicate would execute their hostages immediately and turn the shelter into a kill box. Maya sat beside him in the tactical vehicle, wearing body armor that Min Jae had reluctantly provided, looking like she was heading into battle rather than running from it. Ji-Hoon found himself explaining the assault plan to her, not because she needed to know but because talking helped him process his own strategy, and her questions, naive as they sometimes were, forced him to think through contingencies he might have overlooked. Why not just give them what they want? Maya asked at one point. Tell them you'll negotiate, buy time for people to escape? Because what they want is for me to kneel, Ji-Hoon replied. And the moment I do that, everyone I protect becomes a target. My mother, my people, everyone who depends on my strength. Sometimes the only way to protect people is to be willing to burn the world down to keep them safe. That's a lonely way to live, Maya observed. Yes, Ji-Hoon agreed. It is. They reached the shelter just as the sun was climbing toward midday, and Ji-Hoon's tactical team deployed with the precision of a surgical strike. He could see the Han Syndicate's positions through the satellite feeds his people had established. They'd fortified the main entrances and positioned snipers on the surrounding buildings, exactly as he'd predicted. The shelter's residents were herded into the central space where Ji-Hoon had first found his mother, and the Han Syndicate's leader, Han Do-yoon, was orchestrating the entire production like a theater director staging his masterpiece. Ji-Hoon made the call to begin the assault, and the world exploded into controlled chaos. His teams hit their marks with synchronized efficiency, breaching the shelter from 3 different points while suppressing the sniper positions with precision fire. The Han Syndicate responded exactly as Ji-Hoon had predicted, exactly as he'd planned for, and within 90 seconds his forces had secured 2 of the 3 entrances and were pushing toward the central space where the hostages were held. But Han Do-yoon had planned for this too. As Ji-Hoon's team entered the main chamber, Do-yoon triggered explosives that collapsed part of the ceiling, separating Ji-Hoon's force and creating chaos that turned tactical advantage into desperate survival. Ji-Hoon found himself on the wrong side of the collapse with only 3 of his men, facing a dozen of the Han Syndicate's best soldiers and with no clear line of retreat. The firefight that followed was brutal and intimate, the kind of combat that happened when strategy gave way to survival instinct. Ji-Hoon moved through the smoke and dust like his father's ghost, putting down threats with the cold efficiency of someone who'd been training for this exact scenario since childhood. But even as he fought, even as he cleared the space with professional violence, part of his mind was on Maya, who was supposed to be behind the lines but who he could hear shouting directions to the hostages, guiding them toward the exit routes his people had secured. She'd broken protocol, had moved forward when she was supposed to stay back, and Ji-Hoon felt rage and fear collide in his chest because she was going to get herself killed trying to save people who. He stopped that thought before it could complete, because it would have ended with, aren't worth it. And he realized he didn't believe that anymore. Couldn't believe it, not after watching Maya care for his mother, not after understanding that her value system operated on completely different principles than his own. Ji-Hoon fought his way toward Maya's voice, using the concrete pillars as cover while his remaining men provided suppressing fire. He found her in the alcove where his mother had been living, surrounded by 5 of the shelter's residents who were too injured or traumatized to move quickly. She'd positioned herself between them and the fighting, her body armor making her look like she was playing soldier, except there was nothing playful about the determination in her expression. I told you to stay back, Ji-Hoon said as he reached her position, having to shout over the sound of gunfire. And I told you these were my people, Maya shouted back. I'm not leaving them. There wasn't time to argue because that's when Han Do-yoon emerged from the smoke with 3 of his best soldiers, and Ji-Hoon realized they'd been flanked, had been herded into exactly this position. Do-yoon had sacrificed his own men to create this moment. This confrontation where Ji-Hoon would have to choose between pursuing the man who'd ordered this attack and protecting the people Maya was guarding. Kang Ji-Hoon, Do-yoon said, and his voice carried over the dying echoes of gunfire as both sides recognized the standoff for what it was. The ice boss himself, playing hero for the homeless. Your father would be ashamed. My father, Ji-Hoon replied, his weapon trained on Do-yoon's center mass, taught me that power means being able to destroy your enemies. So thank you for making this easy. But Do-yoon just smiled, and Ji-Hoon saw the remote detonator in his hand a fraction of a second too late. Funny thing about power, Do-yoon said. It makes you think you're in control right up until you realize you never were. He triggered the detonator, and the world became fire and force and the sound of everything breaking at once. Ji-Hoon's last conscious thought before the explosion threw him into darkness was that Maya had been right about all of it. About him, about his world, about the difference between surviving and actually living. And then there was nothing but black. He woke to pain and the sound of someone crying. His ears were ringing. His body felt like it had been used as a hammer's anvil, and when he tried to move he discovered that his left leg was pinned under rubble. But he was alive, which meant Do-yoon's bomb had been positioned to wound rather than kill, to create suffering rather than ending things cleanly. The crying was Maya. She was a few feet away, her armor cracked and bloodied but apparently intact, and she was kneeling over one of the shelter residents, an elderly man Ji-Hoon vaguely recognized from his first night there. The man wasn't moving, and Ji-Hoon understood immediately that Maya's tears were for someone she'd failed to save, someone who died under her protection. Maya, Ji-Hoon managed, his voice rough with dust and smoke. Maya, we need to move. She looked up at him with eyes that were red and devastated, and Ji-Hoon saw in her face the same expression he'd seen in his own mirror after his first kill. The recognition that the world was crueler than any philosophy could justify, that sometimes doing everything right still meant people died, that surviving meant living with the weight of everyone you couldn't save. I couldn't, Maya started, but Ji-Hoon cut her off. I know, he said. But the others need you. The ones who are still alive need you to be strong enough to get them out. Can you do that? Maya wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing blood and tears together, and Ji-Hoon watched her make the same choice he'd made 100 times. To keep moving, to keep fighting, to keep functioning even when everything inside was screaming to stop. She nodded once, stood on shaking legs, and started helping the survivors who could still move toward the exit routes that Ji-Hoon's people had secured. Ji-Hoon managed to free his leg from the rubble, discovering it was badly bruised but not broken, and hauled himself upright through sheer force of will. Around him, the shelter was a war zone, the concrete walls scarred with bullet impacts and burn marks, the air thick with smoke that made breathing painful. But the firing had stopped, which meant either his people had secured the space or the Han Syndicate had withdrawn to regroup. It turned out to be both. Min Jae found Ji-Hoon in the wreckage and delivered the tactical summary. The Han Syndicate's main force had been eliminated or captured, but Do-yoon had escaped in the chaos created by his bomb. The hostages were being evacuated, the injured were being treated, and Ji-Hoon's organization had suffered casualties but remained functional. And Maya? Ji-Hoon asked, because somehow that had become his first question rather than asking about his own people. She's with the survivors, Min Jae reported, helping coordinate medical treatment. Boss, she's... He paused, choosing his words carefully. She's good at this. At making people feel safe even when everything's chaos. Your mother chose well when she let this woman protect her. Ji-Hoon found Maya an hour later, after he'd coordinated the tactical retreat and ensured that the shelter was secured and the survivors were being transported to safe locations. She was sitting on the shelter steps, the same steps he'd descended what felt like a lifetime ago, and she was staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. He sat down beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders almost touched but not quite. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there in the wreckage of Ji-Hoon's world and watched emergency vehicles arrive to clean up violence that had been done in his name, for his mother, because of choices he'd made. 4 people died, Maya finally said, her voice hollow. 4 people I knew. Mr. Chen, who used to share his food even though he barely had enough for himself. Sarah, who was trying to get clean and had been sober for 60 days. Marcus, who was a veteran with PTSD, who just needed someone to see him as human. And Grace, who was 16 years old and had run away from a foster home that was worse than the streets. Ji-Hoon listened to this litany of loss and felt each name like a physical weight. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate but he said them anyway because they were true. Are you? Maya asked, not looking at him. Or are you just sorry they became collateral damage in a war you've been fighting so long you forgot what you were fighting for? The accusation should have made him angry, but instead Ji-Hoon felt something inside him finally, completely break. Not in the way things broke when they were defeated, but in the way things broke when they'd been holding pressure for too long and finally, mercifully released it. You're right, he said quietly, and Maya's head turned to look at him in surprise. About everything. About me, about my world, about what my father made me into. You're right that I can't kill my way to safety, right that power isn't the same as protection, right that somewhere along the way I stopped being human and became just... this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the blood and the gun and everything he represented. Then change, Maya said, and it wasn't a request or a suggestion but a command. You have all this power, all these resources, all these people who follow your orders. Use it for something other than revenge and control. Use it to actually help people instead of just deciding who gets hurt less. Ji-Hoon thought about his mother's words from earlier, about being sold, about Maya having something he'd forgotten how to have. Thought about the boy who'd cried over a bird and the man who'd just orchestrated a tactical assault that left 4 innocent people dead. Thought about the space between who he was and who he might have been if circumstances had been different, if his father had taught him kindness instead of cruelty, if he'd had someone like Maya in his life before the training had calcified into identity. I don't know how, he admitted, and the confession felt more dangerous than any battle he'd fought. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. Maya was quiet for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold and covered in someone else's blood, and she was shaking slightly from adrenaline crash and grief, but she held on with surprising strength. Then learn, she said simply. Start with one choice. Then make another. Then another. Nobody becomes a different person all at once. Ji-Hoon. You just keep making different choices until eventually you look back and realize you're someone new. They sat there on the shelter steps as the sun moved toward evening, holding hands like children who were afraid of the dark, and Ji-Hoon felt the foundation of his worldview continuing its collapse. Everything his father had taught him, everything he believed about power and survival and the necessity of violence, all of it was revealed as incomplete at best and poisonous at worst. He'd spent 15 years building an empire on principles that had gotten 4 innocent people killed and his mother traumatized, and Maya turned into a soldier for a war she'd never wanted to fight. The foundation, Ji-Hoon said suddenly, remembering what he'd told Maya the first night. I was going to establish a foundation in your name. To honor the debt I owed you for protecting my mother. I don't want a foundation in my name, Maya replied. But I'll help you build one in theirs. She nodded toward the shelter. For people like Mr. Chen and Sarah and Marcus and Grace. People who deserve better than a world that treats them like they're disposable. That's going to require resources, Ji-Hoon said, his mind already starting to calculate logistics. Money. Property. Personnel. It's going to require dismantling parts of my organization, redirecting operations away from profit toward. He paused, trying to find the right word. Toward giving a shit about people, Maya supplied bluntly. Yeah. It's going to require that. Ji-Hoon looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who'd protected his mother but the person who'd somehow managed to maintain her humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. She'd survived the shelter without becoming cruel, had lived in the margins without losing sight of the center, had given everything to someone who couldn't repay her because that's what love actually meant. Giving without the promise of return. I'll need help, Ji-Hoon said. I'll need someone who understands what these people need, who can speak their language, who they'll trust. Someone who... I'll do it, Maya interrupted. But not as your employee. And not as someone you pay to ease your conscience. If we're doing this, we're doing it as partners. Equal say, equal responsibility, equal commitment to actually making it work. Ji-Hoon considered the offer and realized it wasn't really an offer at all. It was a test. Maya was asking him to give up control, to trust someone else, to operate on principles that didn't put him at the center of every decision. It went against everything his father had taught him about power and protection, and the necessity of absolute authority. Which was exactly why he needed to say yes. Partners, Ji-Hoon agreed, and held out his hand formally. Maya took it, and they shook on the deal there on the shelter steps, surrounded by the wreckage of his old world and the possibility of something new. The months that followed were harder than any battle Ji-Hoon had fought. Restructuring his organization to operate on different principles, redirecting resources away from traditional syndicate activities toward legitimate business and social support, navigating the complex politics of being a reformed criminal who was trying to do good. All of it required a different kind of strength than he'd been trained for. But Maya was there for every decision, every setback, every moment when Ji-Hoon wanted to revert to old patterns because they were easier and more familiar. His mother lived with them in the compound outside Seoul, her dementia progressing slowly but steadily, and she had moments of lucidity where she'd look at Ji-Hoon and Maya working together and smile like she was seeing something she'd always hoped for. The foundation they built helped hundreds of people transition out of homelessness, provided medical care and addiction treatment and job training, became known as the place where society's forgotten could find second chances. The Han Syndicate, weakened by their failed assault and Ji-Hoon's systematic dismantling of their operations, eventually sued for peace. Do-Yoon was never found, disappeared into whatever shadows consumed men who failed as spectacularly as he had, but the threat he represented faded as Ji-Hoon's reputation transformed from ruthless boss to something more complicated. Someone who'd chosen change over comfort, growth over stagnation, connection over control. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Ji-Hoon still had moments where his father's training overwhelmed his better intentions, where he defaulted to violence and intimidation because those tools were familiar and effective. But Maya was there to call him out, to remind him of his promises, to show him through her own example that there were other ways to be strong. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ji-Hoon began to remember what it felt like to cry over a wounded bird, to care about something beyond power and survival, to be human in ways his father had tried to train out of him. He'd never be the boy who'd wept over nature's cruelty. That boy was gone forever, lost to circumstances and choices that couldn't be unmade. But he could be something else. A man who'd been a monster and chose to become something different, not because it was easy but because it was possible. Because Maya had shown him it was possible. The story could have ended there, with redemption and reform and the suggestion that people could change if they wanted to badly enough. But life wasn't a story, and change wasn't a destination but a process that never stopped requiring work. So instead, the story ended with Ji-Hoon and Maya standing in front of a new shelter they'd built on the site of the old one, watching people file in for the opening ceremony. His mother was there in a wheelchair, her mind mostly gone now but her expression peaceful, and she was holding both their hands like she understood what they'd built even if she couldn't articulate it. "Subscribe to see how this unfolds," Maya said suddenly, and Ji-Hoon looked at her in confusion until he saw she was talking to a young woman with a video camera, someone from a media organization covering the shelter's opening. "Comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Because it's still going. It's still happening. And maybe someone out there needs to know that change is possible, that people aren't just what their worst moments made them, that you can survive terrible things and still choose kindness on the other side." The young woman with the camera smiled and promised to include that message, and Ji-Hoon found himself wondering how many people would see it, how many would understand what Maya was really saying. That salvation wasn't about grand gestures or perfect transformation but about the daily choice to be better than you were, one decision at a time, until eventually you looked in the mirror and recognized the person staring back as someone you didn't hate. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all any of them had. The choice to keep trying, the decision to keep caring, the commitment to keep building something better even when the world made it easier to tear things down. Ji-Hoon squeezed his mother's hand and felt her squeeze back, and for just a moment, he swore he saw recognition in her eyes. Not of him necessarily, but of what he'd become, of the man he was still learning to be. And he thought maybe, somewhere, his father was watching too, though whether with approval or disappointment Ji-Hoon would never know. But it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't living for his father's approval or his organization's expectations or anything except the simple, revolutionary idea that Maya had shown him. That love without condition was worth more than power without limit, and that the only way to truly protect the people you cared about was to give them a world worth living in rather than just surviving through. It was a lesson that had cost him everything he thought mattered and given him back everything that actually did. And as he stood there in the Seoul afternoon, watching people who'd been broken find the courage to be whole again, Ji-Hoon felt something he hadn't experienced since he was 7 years old and crying over a wounded bird. Hope that the world, despite all evidence to the contrary, might still be capable of kindness if enough people chose to demand it. The story didn't end with a neat bow or perfect resolution. It ended with work yet to be done, with lives still needing saving, with Maya and Ji-Hoon returning to the compound where his mother waited and where tomorrow they'd wake up and do it all over again. The messy, complicated, infinitely worthwhile work of being human in a world that made inhumanity so much easier. But at least now they were doing it together, partners in the truest sense, building something that might outlast them both. And if that wasn't redemption, it was close enough to feel like grace.